So I will share my screen here and we will get started shortly. Okay, yes, Creative Schools Fund grant guidelines. As a quick overview, many of you may know this already, but the Creative Schools Fund exists largely in proximity to the organization Ingenuity, whose goal is to support increased access to high quality arts education for every student in every grade. The fund does this specifically by supporting teacher designed arts programs happening at CPS. So we're supporting arts education that's taking place at a school level with the understanding and knowledge that teachers and arts liaisons at these schools have the best knowledge as far as what arts learning their students would benefit from. This is a competitive process largely, and this is through a public-private partnership, which is why Jess is with us today, because we work very closely with CPS, specifically CPS's Department of Arts Education, and we also receive support from the Mayor's Office of the City of Chicago. So this is a fund that is a mixture of public and private contributions, which have totaled up to almost 16 million since 2013, which was when the fund originally started. For this first section, we're going to go over the Creative Schools support strategies as far as just situating the Creative Schools Fund and where it is in relationship to the many other initiatives that are also happening to increase access to arts education opportunities in schools. So talking a bit first about the school certification survey and this image. Hopefully this is familiar to all of you, most of you, hopefully, but this is an image or screenshot of the Artlook map. This is a tool that was developed by Ingenuity, and this is a tool that is used in tandem with the Creative School Certification Survey. So every year, schools participate in this survey, which measures the extent to which they've met district designed benchmarks to ensure that schools are getting quality arts education to their students, both as far as them having ready access to it and as far as it being high quality. So we get the information from these surveys that schools participate in. I believe the last one just closed in October technically, but it's still technically open. So if you're from a school who for some reason hasn't completed their survey yet, it's not too late. But all of that to say, once we have that data, we update the Artlook map and it gives a visual indicator of just where arts education is in the city. So Artlook is a tool that will list schools and will show, hope also depending on how recently schools have updated it, will show what disciplines are being offered at these schools, what instructors are teaching, and also what these schools' certification levels are. On the opposite end, we also have partner data listed as well for partners that do upload their information to Artlook, which is a requirement for applying for a grant. But this can be a tool that's leveraged both for schools to find partners if they're missing a certain discipline or would like to bring a certain discipline to their school, or for partners to find schools if they are looking for particular schools that don't have the disciplines that they offer. So this is also to plug chicago.artlookmap.com as a tool for finding more information, but also connecting it to the fact that this works closely in tandem with the Creative Schools Survey, which is where we get a lot of our data about arts education in CPS. Speaking a bit more about this and like the nuances of the actual survey that's taken and the scoring that comes from that. So that consists of 11 rubric elements, and all of these cumulatively represent access, which is about 2/3 of what Creative School Certification scoring is, and quality, which is about 1/3. I'm gonna ask if Jess, if you have anything to add here as far as just nuances or other things that would be good to consider or for schools to know.
Yeah, I think, this sort of outlines the measures that sit within access, which is sort of staffing per school. So the number of full-time teachers per students at the school, minutes of instruction at the school per week per student, and then access and disciplines in depth, which focuses specifically on high school. So sort of, the number of disciplines you have at your school, and then sort of the level of depth within that discipline. So if you're teaching music, is there music 1, 2, etc. And then quality is sort of something that has become a little bit new here, and we're focusing more on. And those are things that, some of these things are things that you may not cost as much to sort of change and sort of increase your score. So those are sort of, having someone from your arts team in a governance role at your school, seeing what the amount of budgeting per student is at your school. Partnerships, which we are here talking a little bit about today with the Creative Schools Fund grant. And you'll see here that the available points for each of these things. And now for the first time this past year, the survey that schools filled out, the total score is 100. And so schools would score within that 100 range to get sort of to the, and I think Ola will go to the next level, which explains like scoring. And so how those points sort of convert into that scoring system, which I think many folks here are familiar with. So that sort of folks who score in that 90 to 100 points range are going to have that rating of excelling with their creative school certification score, and so on down the sort of the ratings. So, and folks who don't complete the survey, that's sort of that incomplete data section. But there's some changes that have been made to the certification over the past couple of years, and more of that will be rolling out in the rest of this week. So certainly stay tuned to that. But this is sort of a nice overview of what that certification looks like.
Yes, David, I see a hand raised.
Yeah, sorry, quick question. So do schools with a lower rating, are they given priority for funds, or is it sort of blind in that sense?
I would say that's fair to say. That's certainly something that doesn't mean that excelling or strong schools won't receive funds. Of course, there are plenty that do, but we definitely are looking at our portfolio from an equity lens as well, as far as looking at the amount of the district that still hasn't quite met the benchmarks that indicate a strong arts education presence and what we can do to get there. So I will say to some extent that we will have extra priority for those schools. Jess, is there anything that you would add?
Yeah, I think Ola, covered that nicely. But one thing I will say, we're in the process of making sure that the certification score and the actual supports sync up together, so that schools very much will see, hey, I need some support in this specific area that my number is low on. You're going to start to see some supports roll out that will help specifically increase that specific number for a school, so that it's very clear, like, hey, I'm low on minutes of instruction. Here's a grant that will specifically support minutes of instruction and getting that number up so that they can move their score up. So those are certainly things we're thinking about and moving into that piece. But yes.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for that question. And the only thing I would add is that the number one eligibility criteria for completing or for applying for a Creative Schools Fund grant is that schools must complete the most recent survey in order to be eligible. So again, if for some reason, which, lots is happening, lots of things are happening. So if some reason you haven't gotten around to completing your school survey, please do so as soon as possible so you can be eligible for this opportunity. Okay, so talking a bit more about these supports and kind of putting the Creative Schools Fund in context. The Creative Schools Fund is actually a part of a collective group of supports that all exist to further the mission and the goal of increased arts access to every student in the district. So we have the Creative Schools Fund, which is what you are all here for. This is primarily managed by Ingenuity. As I mentioned, this is a competitive grant process. And below, we have the areas that we will be funding through the Creative Schools Fund. So residencies and student experiences, this is primarily what we are here to focus on. And then there are a couple other areas as well that are more invitation only, and we'll touch a bit more on briefly. And I will pass things on to Jess to talk a bit more about the other supports as well.
So new this year is the Creative Teachers Fund. And that piece actually is, as opposed to the Creative Schools Fund, which is a school level grant, the Creative Teachers Fund is going to be a teacher level grant. And those opportunities you're going to see are Skyline integration. We already have a group of teachers who began at the beginning of the school year underway who are working to work on integrating Skyline curriculum into their work. The other piece of that is foundational professional learning, and then instructional coaching. Instructional coaching is where we're working on finalizing that piece, and there should be more information on that piece soon. Arts Essentials. So Arts Essentials, I'm sure most folks who are school-based on this call are very familiar. Schools who complete the survey get an automatic $1,000 in their budget for arts materials and supplies, specifically to support arts courses at your school.
So diving a bit more into the Creative Schools Fund, since that is what we are here for. This year we have 2 grant cycles. The fall application cycle closed October 8th. The winter one opened today. At I think 8 a.m. officially, the application was open and ready to use, and it will remain open until February 7th. So pretty much exactly 2 months there. So to give an overview of the strategies, we've mentioned a couple times, or at least once already, residencies and student learning experiences. This is what the fund has historically supported and continues to prioritize: high quality partnerships, largely in the form of residencies with arts organizations that are in Chicago. This is an application, or this is a grant strategy that is open to any school that completes the Creative Schools Certification Survey and any school that has an arts liaison. And really the primary requisite / requirement of this grant is that schools partner with an arts organization. You cannot receive this if you do not partner with an arts org. That's what's highlighted in blue. The other categories that are highlighted speak to what Jess was talking about earlier in regards to changes that are happening with the certification survey and ways we are thinking critically about how we can leverage the fund to help schools advance certain parts of their certification where there may be more opportunity for growth. So minutes of instruction, I'll just talk about the rest of these somewhat briefly since they aren't the focus of this session necessarily. We rolled out minutes of instruction in the fall. This was to support elementary schools, working with them so that they could revise their master schedules to get closer to that 120 minutes of weekly arts instruction. That was taking place in the fall. We also have for the winter dedicated art spaces, which exist to support and expand art spaces in the schools, like spaces in the schools that are designated for arts learning. This is often in the form of capital projects. And then we have disciplines in depth. That is like the counter to the minutes of instruction application that we had for schools in the fall. So disciplines in depth focuses on high schools, and it is centered on expanding the number of disciplines and or the depth at which those disciplines are offered at each school. This can often take the form of curriculum consultancy, developing teacher skills and planning. And with both categories, one could consult an arts partner as a vendor for supports. So all of that to say, these categories that are in this golden yellow are invitation only. So because they are based on certification data and very specific metrics, we will be emailing schools in exactly a week to let them know if they are eligible for these opportunities. So moving along to timeline for this period, as I mentioned that this was really the main thing about this info session as far as new information that would be different from others. So one thing that's different about the fund this year is that we have 2 application periods, as has been mentioned. With the fall application period, all programming would need to conclude by the end of this school year, so by June 2022. With this winter application period, one of the really great things about applying during this time is that there's a added flexibility there. So one could apply for a winter application period grant, and they could implement in spring, or they could use the spring to plan and implement throughout the 2023 school year. So it's possible for the grant funds to extend over the course of 3 semesters. This allows schools to plan better. It's helpful for partners to plan as well. So any schools that are looking to hit the ground running in the fall with their programming may consider submitting for the winter application period. And I don't know if there's anything you would add, just in addition, as far as just timeline goes. If not, no worries.
No, I don't think so. I think that sort of covers it. I know we'll go into more application specific stuff in a little bit.
Okay. So yes, that is the timeline. So just noting that there's extra flexibility there. And then getting into spending limits and some other limits. How many times can you apply? Assuming the you in question is the arts liaison. As I mentioned, the number 1 eligibility criteria for receiving a Creative Schools Fund grant is completing the survey. The second is that it must be a principal nominated arts liaison who is submitting the application. And this is the person who ultimately decides how often a grant is applied for. There's a limit of 2 times for residency grants. So a school can apply once in the fall and once in the winter. It is possible for a school to receive a grant for the fall period and apply again and receive one for the winter period as well, especially if the winter application period grant would be for something that would be for fall 2022 or even spring 2023. I will just add, if a school were to receive 2 grants with the idea or with the thought of using both for implementation at the same time, I think that would be a bit tricky. And I would just be mindful about monitoring time and capacity to make sure that 2 programs could happen concurrently. I will also add that the Creative Schools Fund and the Creative Teachers Fund are 2 entities that operate independently, although they're part of the same system. So a teacher can participate in a Creative Teachers Fund grant and still apply for and potentially receive a Creative Schools Fund grant as well. Moving on to expectations, this is where we get a bit more into eligibility requirements. I feel like I've already said this at least 5 times at this point, but I'll just say again, participating in the most recent Creative Schools certification survey is the number 1 criteria for being eligible to apply for a residencies grant. And then right behind that, you must have a principal nominated arts liaison who is the one submitting the application. Of course, with the understanding that more often than not, this is a collaborative process to submit the grant. It should be, considering that multiple people across the school/arts organization will be involved. But we look to the arts liaison as the person who is the strategic planner for the arts in their school and the person who is also our point person as we make grant communications. So those things, those are the 2 of the primary and really only requirements for a residencies grant. Additionally, this is something we've added that's new or that was not a consideration last time. We are going to give a bit of additional priority to schools that demonstrate a commitment to including the arts in their governance structures through an arts-focused strategy on their continuous improvement work plan, an arts educator on their instructional leadership team, and an arts educator on their next continuous improvement work plan team, writing team. It's a lot of words. All of that to say that this is not something that's going to make or break whether one receives a grant, but it's something that we take into extra consideration. And I invite Jess to also just provide a bit more context, I think, behind our decision to also have this be an additional priority area.
Yeah, I think the more we see teachers involved in those CIWP plans, the more successful we see these programs as well as other arts programmings in the school become. And so that's certainly something that we see as a benefit. We also, as Ola said, this is not something that, you know, that's going to make or break an application, because we understand that a lot of times arts teachers are maxed in their capacity and end up playing the person who wears many hats. So that's something also that we're cognizant of as well.
Yes, thank you for that extra context. And I would just add very quickly, if you've received a Creative Schools Fund grant last year, then you must have also done all the necessary compliance. So that includes a site visit request when they were all virtual last year. So a virtual site visit request, submitting your grant report, and of course, just adhering to all the policies in the implementation guide. So if you received a grant last year, you would have had to also adhere to all these things to be eligible for a grant this year. So getting a bit into timeline and what you can expect, today, the winter application period begins because the application is open. This is also the day that we have our first info session. Following that, in a week, we will have messaging out to schools that are eligible for these invitation only grants that were mentioned earlier. So dedicated art spaces and disciplines in depth. We have a few more info sessions scheduled, one happening next week and then 2 happening in January. And then following that, there will be, in the days leading up to the closure of the application period, we will be holding office hours, and that will just be a time that you can make an appointment for 15 minutes or so and ask any application specific questions that you have as far as just needing guidance or clarity or both of those things. And then the 7th is when the winter application period ends, and that is the final deadline to submit a grant at 11:59 p.m. That is a Monday, so there will be that first weekend of February to also get additional work done if that's needed. And then we are aiming for mid to late March for the notification of award / funds transfer. I must say that this mid to late March, that is the goal, and we're hoping to get there. Sometimes there are factors that may be somewhat out of our control, but the hope is that schools will be able to implement programming or begin to by the beginning of April of 2022. And then for timeline, I'm gonna let Jess speak a bit more about the implementation timeline.
Sorry about that. I couldn't find the actual mute button.
It happens.
Getting late. Yeah, so implementation timeline. This piece will sort of, for the Creative Schools Fund grant piece only, not the other sort of pieces that were highlighted in yellow. Those will have a little bit of a slightly different uniqueness to them. So keep that in mind. But regarding the implementation timeline, a couple of things to note that I think we'll touch on a little bit when we talk about some uniqueness to Creative Schools Fund stuff in another slide. But certain things require a little bit more time, such as murals or any sort of changes to a building itself. So that timeline might take a little bit longer to actually implement. So all activities, you know, we really anticipate that funds will excuse me, sorry. It's getting late, guys.
Words are hard.
I know, they really are at this point in the day. Yeah, so funds, as Ola said, would be put into schools' budgets by the end of hopefully March, and then actual implementation would begin. And then depending on the idea is that you will have these funds until the end of the end of either December, depending on funding source, or the end of June 2023. So there will be a longer implementation period time, which we know for some schools that's irrelevant because you want to work with your students that you have now, and so it will wrap in June. In some schools, if you're doing something such as a mural that takes a lot more time, that window of time will be longer so that it can be executed properly. But CPS, as well as Ingenuity, have spent a great deal of time looking through the funding sources we have and the deadlines that those funds expire on, and started to think through how we can better implement this and divvy out funds at the times that they actually within that grant period, because the funds we get all operate on slightly different grant periods, and so we have to stay within those guidelines. So that sort of helps provide folks with a little bit more of a time period, and you'll see that will be really clear with folks that if you are in an implementation window, you'll get funds and they'll end at the end of the school year, but you may get more funds that end up coming into your budget in the fall. So there's some nuance to it, and folks will get some clear guidance depending on sort of what type of programming they're working on doing.
Yes. So basically, it sounds like it's difficult to give kind of a blanket timeline as far as it's difficult to give a blanket timeline for certain things because it really will depend on whether or not the school is applying for funds to be implemented and used that spring of 2022 or whether it's for the following school year. So that will be a bit of a case by case basis. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like that's kind of what you were saying, Jess.
That is correct, yes.
Awesome. So digging a bit deeper into residencies and student learning experiences, which I think much of this information will be familiar to folks who have received or have applied for a Creative Schools Fund grant before. As I've mentioned, the fund has a history of supporting partnerships that are happening with arts organizations, and that is still the case for this. So as far as specifications and requirements, as mentioned, I mean, it's kind of in the name, this is a strategy that requires partnership with an active CPS vendor. So if any schools are thinking of working with vendors who are not active currently with CPS, I would highly encourage these schools to, and the staff from these schools to urge their partners to get vendor status as soon as possible, since that is something that takes a decent amount of time. But as an overview, this is a grant strategy that is meant to enable arts teachers to collaborate with arts organizations in order to fill gaps in instruction, build community through the arts, deepen arts quality, and or advance justice through the arts. I will be talking a bit more about each of these sub-goals in the following slide. These grants cap at $10,000. And as I've mentioned before, all schools that have participated in the Creative Schools Fund survey, not Creative Schools Fund survey, the Creative Schools Certification Survey are eligible. And again, reiterating that the partner must be an active CPS vendor, must be active. As someone had brought up earlier as a question, I want to say that was David, but you know, if I'm wrong, I'm sorry. But yes, we are going to give some priority to school with limited partnerships and staffing. And these often are schools that are developing or emerging in the arts per the following point. This is a grant that typically supports residencies. I would say we largely support residencies. We also have lines for professional learning, other relevant services, supplies, and teacher extended day pay. We do have a line for field trips with the caveat that there must be some contingency plan in place. Just looking at local health guidelines, there's this variant that we don't know about. So just keeping in mind that an in-person field trip might not be possible, we will be asking schools to provide some kind of contingency. And that,
can I just chime in quickly and say that the district strongly encourages virtual field trips. So if there's a vendor who has that that is an option, I would strongly encourage virtual field trips at this time.
Okay, thank you for that addition. Yes, so virtual strongly encouraged. regardless, we will be asking you to provide some kind of backup plan to make sure that that will always be an option. And then as far as limits to grant uses, we do not cover any student instruction that is happening out of school. It must be taking place during the school day. So we don't fund any after school programming. And then we also will not be funding any initiative or program that would replace instruction from a certified or endorsed arts teacher, or one that would reduce their hours. So getting a bit more specific about the grant goals that we have here, schools must choose one of these goals in their application. Regardless of the goal that is chosen, all projects must have a clear arts focus. I'm saying that knowing that arts integration is also something that we value, and often that does happen organically with the way that these partnerships play out, but the clear arts focus is something that needs to come through very clearly in the application. So going through these categories, fill gaps in arts instruction. This is one that the fund has had for a long time and just, I guess, retired for a bit last year, but we're bringing back. So I would say all of these categories should look familiar if you've applied for a grant somewhat recently. Fill gaps in arts instruction is centered on identifying gaps in discipline or depth and filling those gaps through partnerships and or professional development with a teacher. So this can be something responding to student interest. This can be something like your students express interest in putting on a musical, you only have a music department, so you partner with a theater organization to make that happen. So we're centering that kind of receptiveness to student interest, and also any programs that already build on the existing arts education structures that are at a school. We also have build community through the arts. This category and the two following it were created and debuted last year, and we're building off of creating these initiatives that were developed largely in response to many of the things that were happening in 2020 and just emerging needs from the district that are still present. So we've kept these categories. But building community through the arts is about leveraging arts to celebrate, connect, and unite school communities. The focus here is very much school-wide projects that span grade bands, and also projects that have a social emotional learning component or focus to them. That's what we look for with that category. Deepen arts quality. This is very much about building high quality artistic practice among teachers and or students. So this can be a category where you have an arts organization that is working to develop skills with a classroom of students, or it can be a teacher working one-on-one with an arts organization to deepen their own skill set. And of course, them being an educator, that would transfer and trickle down to their students and the school. So there are a couple ways that deepening arts quality could go as far as a program that would be a good fit for this. And then lastly, we have advanced justice through the arts. This is a category where student focus, as I would say, is more so something that we prioritize more than in other categories, specifically because this is to support student-driven projects where they're using art as a medium to advance anti-racism and racial justice. And we're looking at projects that are taking place from students' lived experiences, projects that students largely design and implement to an extent, and also projects that may have a civic and community component as far as looking at how those things interact with and can leverage the arts as a tool for change. So that's an overview of the 4 categories for grant goals. So you will choose one upon applying. And we've also added something new that's this year is an additional question for those who are returning grantees. Since we do have quite a few schools who have received multiple Creative Schools Fund grants, and we completely support and understand the potential for these long-term partnerships, knowing that a lot of growth happens with year-over-year growth and being able to scaffold. We really just want to be sure and to know that this is for schools that are working with the same partners or just receiving a grant year after year, knowing that there's some intentionality behind that. So we have a question that just asks, are you working with the same group? If you're a returning grantee, are you working with the same group of students? Are you working with a different group of students? Are you leveraging like learnings from the previous year to apply to this year? This is just a question for us to just kind of have more information, just so we can know that there is some intention behind receiving a Creative Schools Fund grant for another year in a row. And then moving to spending guidelines. Yes, all of the fun things. So I will pass this on to Jess actually to talk a bit more about these budget items and these guidelines.
Yeah, so I feel like Ola has sprinkled in some of this as we've gone through. It's really imperative that these sort of guidelines regarding spending are followed. You know, aside from the fact that we have, you know, funds that come from specific places and we're required to sort of meet the guidelines within those grants, you know, there are just CPS policies and procedures that we are required to follow. So that those are just a couple of things that sort of we have no choice about, unfortunately. So a couple of those things: eligible spending budget lines, in school time for arts programming provided by arts partners. So as Ola said, we do not, the fund does not support out of school time programming. If you are interested in out of school time programming, there is an entire department that does that work, and they are lovely, and they will be more than happy to sort of assist you. You know, they have specific funding for their work as well. So it's certainly worth, if that's what you're looking for, go reach out to those guys. So teacher non-instructional extended day pay. So, you know, this really is going to apply to, you know, when you're having those planning meetings with your partner, things like that, that you should, you know, make sure that you as a teacher are getting paid for your time. So consulting supports for professional development, curriculum development, or arts integration. So that again would sort of fall under the line of the sort of services arts partner line. Materials and supplies. So that's very much like what you would spend your arts essentials money on. So lots of the, if you're thinking visual arts, you're thinking like paper and crayons and all that sort of stuff. And then if you're thinking of theater, you're thinking of costumes. So in music, there's certainly, I'm not a musician, so I don't know that stuff as well, but there are certainly supplies in that realm as well. Hardware and equipment that's valued at 500 or more. So this is, you know, really going to fall in that area of sort of those laptops, printers, iPads. Something to note specifically about that. You know, the district has very specific contracts with vendors. So if you're looking to buy an iPad or an Apple product with funds that are, you know, fit within your grant proposal, of course, that work specifically with this partnership that you're doing, keep in mind that the district has an Apple contract, and you cannot buy an Apple product from, say, B&H or Best Buy, even though they happen to be a CPS vendor. We are required to buy those products from Apple under their contract. So it's just something to keep in mind. Other laptops are purchased by other vendors such as CSW. So it's just something to have in the back of your mind when you're planning your budget. Unfortunately, sometimes you might see a cheaper price for a product somewhere else, but make sure you're checking in with your clerk. They are, you know, they're gold mines, and they know all these ins and outs really well, or they will call school support and they will get you the help you need. So it's something to keep in mind when you're planning that budget. Spending limits, yeah, as Ola mentioned, grants can't be spent to pay actual arts teacher salaries. Another piece of this that's always a little tricky and complicated to explain is that arts partners that have specific, you know, proprietary software or technology platforms that they have developed themselves and use, and they create unique logins for teachers or students. Those really have to be approved by CPS's IT department. Due to the new SOPA law that many of you might be familiar with at this point, to protect students' information online, there are quite a lot of laws in place now that prohibit the use of software in schools that's collecting student data. So all that software needs to be approved by IT in advance. And I will tell you that is not a quick process. So if you're applying for a grant now and you are going to start that process, I wouldn't anticipate that it's going to work out in that timeline. That's something you should have come in with already ready to go. Say, hey, look, I've got an agreement in place, and make sure that it's the right agreement. There are different departments and they have different agreements, so it's a little bit complicated. But if you have questions about that, feel free to reach out to Ola or I, and we could certainly help direct you to the right folks. Regarding murals, I don't know if there are any mural folks on the call. I know that it's been a bit frustrating because we've really had a lot of our contracts delayed, but we are in the process of working closely with our law department to sort of unsnag that and create a more streamlined approach to public art, and to actually have a sort of like a template contract that the partner as well as the CPS can fill out and get murals done and executed in a much more timely manner. But something to note that we are moving forward with now is that if you propose a mural as your partnership or a mosaic, anything that's sort of got some permanence in the school, the first piece of that will be that you will get an implementation funding grant. I believe, Ola, right, it's going to be $1,000 for implementation. And what that will do is it will give you planning time to work with your arts partner, plan what that mural will look like, see what type of student involvement you want in the process. And then if you are awarded your contract is approved, your project is approved by all the right pieces, capital construction, communications, there's quite a few folks who have to sort of sign off on it. Well, if it's approved, then you will sort of get the rest of the funding in what's called the planning phase of the project. This is really to make sure schools are set up for success and they are not jumping into a mural project and then you don't end up getting to execute it. We really want this to be successful. I work very closely with lots of schools on trying to make this stuff happen, and I care deeply about making sure we've got public art everywhere in our schools. And so, I want to make sure we can actually have these projects happen. So if you have questions about that, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to sort of help walk through what that process looks like. And then there's just a little bit of a breakdown of what the budget should sort of look like. So at least 70% of program budget should be dictated to services provided by the arts partner, and up to 30% of program budget may be allocated to non-partner spending. So that's going to be that sort of supplies, the teacher and non-instructional extended day pay. Another thing to note, I know this is still a little new to some folks, but supplies and materials, if they're not proprietary, really need to be purchased by the school. The district has very large contracts with vendors like Shore Learning and school specialty, and so a lot of the music vendors. So we have prices that they're very much a benefit to this, and so it's really beneficial that schools work with their clerks, develop budgets, and purchase the supplies and materials they need for these programmings through a CPS approved vendor and not through the arts partner. Not just because of that, but because it's a little bit of a procurement law rule called stringing, that if somebody's buying something from another vendor through a vendor, it can be a little bit of a policy procedure issue. So it's just something to keep in mind as you're sort of filling out budgets and writing these grant proposals.
And after that very thorough breakdown of all the spending guidelines, there's just a bit more in regards to eligibility. Much of this, some of this is some stuff that I've already said earlier. Okay, yes, sorry. And the note is worth mentioning. Yes, so this is for vendors. And any school that's working with a vendor, if you are representing the school side, should definitely work with your vendor to ensure that they're meeting all of these things that are being outlined. As far as eligibility for vendors, one thing that I mentioned earlier was the Chicago Art Look map, and just ensuring that vendors have their most up-to-date information on that map would be super important. Ensure an up-to-date profile in the iSupplier portal. Yes, so I know less about this, but I know that it is required. This is very much related to procurement and being able to pay these vendors if your school were to receive a grant. And then following that, holding the appropriate tier status for proposed activities. Tier status was something that I know was rolled out in 2020 when the remote learning began. And this is these are levels that, well, these are levels that any entity who is not a school staff member, like an arts partner, would need in order to work with a school remotely. I think all partners would have tier 1 status if they were approved for it. Is that correct, Jess? Or is it
so regarding tier,
yeah,
regarding tier status, I know a lot of folks already have tier status to work remotely with students because of during the remote learning part of the pandemic. I know some of you might be saying, well, I'm in a school now, why do I need this? This is a contingency plan. You know, it's something our law department has and procurement have pushed and said, hey, no, let's just make sure it's still there, just in case. Let's not put ourselves in a position to have to roll something out in the middle of a crisis. So it's still required that you have tier status. Tier 1 is really all that you need. And all this does is sort of keep you in compliance with the acceptable use policy to communicate with students in a remote learning environment. And really this just is about safety for our students and making sure that they are safe, whether they're in a school building or they're in a remote environment in a Google Meet. So that's really all that is.
Thank you. Yes. I too was trying to find the words and was having trouble. These early sunsets are really like killing my brain. I feel like after 4:30, it's just harder to talk. But maybe that's just me. But moving on a bit to application limits, which is below that, just calling out that we will not support or fund more than 15 applications associated with a single partner. As far as vendor spending goes. And then we have a separate list of certain partners who have applied through CPS's RFQ process. Arts partners, for some may be familiar with this, or some may have already done this. This was a process that was rolled out in the fall/summer of 2020, and really serving as kind of an extra like an extra seal of approval as far as these being arts partners that were vetted by CPS and have been determined to be high quality. They are not necessarily subject to this application limit, but what I will say is, as we review the portfolio and think about equity and think about access and think about what initiatives we want to support. That's not to say that a school that's a strategic source, or that a partner that's a strategic source vendor could submit 20 applications and they all would be funded. That would be unlikely, just in the interest of keeping a balanced portfolio, but just something to call out. And then as far as expectations and the implementation guide and the policy for really just receiving funds and invoicing, I will pass this on to Jess as well to speak a bit more about.
Yeah, so specifically for partners, you know, before anything can begin, you really need the funds. And so once you sort of get that notification that you've received those funds, when you're working with an arts partner, you really want to make sure you get a quote from that arts partner. And that really, I sometimes see folks submit like multiple purchase orders for one program, and you don't necessarily need to do that. If you're going to work in one program, you can, and the vendor can certainly invoice as they deliver services. You don't have to wait until everything's completely done to pay a vendor $7,000 or whatever the amount is that you have in your quote. They can certainly invoice for every couple of weeks and of services delivered, but you want to make sure whatever's being invoiced on that purchase order has actually been delivered already. But that's something to keep in mind. You could certainly break up your quote that way so that it says, hey, you know, we're going to do $2,000 for these 2 weeks, and another 2,000 are going to be for these 2 weeks. So that's just something as arts partners, I strongly encourage, so that way you're not sort of, that you're getting funds throughout the course of this programming that you're doing. Once the school has your quote, they can open a purchase order. As a partner, ask for a copy of that purchase order so you have it for your own records. It doesn't always get sent to partners, I've realized. So just say, hey, I haven't gotten that purchase order from you. I'd like a copy of it. Just keep that with you so you have it with your information. When you're invoicing, just be incredibly clear about what you're invoicing on, which purchase order you're invoicing on, and that you have a unique number with that invoice so that you're not wondering why your payment is stalled. You can only imagine the amount of invoices that get submitted to a district the size of CPS. So that's something to really keep in mind. Please make sure that everyone's background checked and that you've confirmed that before starting. I've certainly had some folks call me and say, hey, we've got teachers at the door and apparently they're not background checked and they can't come in. There's not much I can do about that if it's at that point. So make sure you've got your folks background checked and they're ready to go well in advance. And if you have questions about that, you can certainly email backgroundchecks@cps.edu and confirm anything. So I think if you're going to do anything with a mural and mosaic, as I mentioned, you need approval from capital construction and facilities before anything can happen. That's essentially just to make sure that they weren't going to tear down that wall to do work on it, which is something we would hate to have happen. And then, as we mentioned already before, ITS approval on software. And computer-based programming, and then complying with any other CPS vendor policies and protocols. I can't imagine this is very interesting, but I strongly encourage folks to always look at the CPS procurement website page. There's a FAQ on there that's actually rather helpful and informative. Log into your iSupplier accounts and update your information. The reason I see vendors not get paid very regularly is because that information is outdated and they were sent important information they needed to update with procurement and it didn't happen. And so their vendor number gets turned off. So just be really on top of those pieces. I know our strategic source vendors are, and so those guys are usually always good to go. But if you're a smaller partner, I know it can be hard to not have an operations person on your team, like doing all these pieces. So, please feel free to reach out for help if you need it. But there's a lot of information on that procurement website that I actually think is pretty helpful, as well as the sort of iSupplier account. So just those are some things to have in your toolbox as you're working on these things. I know it's not always easy to work with us, and I acknowledge that, and we're trying all the time to make that process better and smoother for folks. But we work within a system that's larger than us, and we have to follow those policies and procedures as well. So just a couple of things to keep in mind.
And this is our last slide before we wrap up and leave some time for questions. We just wanted to call attention to this partnership that is happening between the Creative Schools Fund and Lollapalooza. We're working with Lollapalooza to administer $2.2 million over a course of 5 years. This was their commitment to the Creative Schools Fund, particularly in wanting to support developing and emerging schools. All of this to say that no school needs to do anything separate to apply for a Lollapalooza Arts Education Fund grant. It is kind of already baked into the structure of the Creative Schools Fund. It's not going to change or impact anything about how you actually apply, but this is more just calling attention to the fact that the fund is something that Lollapalooza has some investment in as well. And lastly, we just have contact information if you have any questions. So what I'm going to do is stop sharing my screen, and I want to say I feel like some questions came through in the chat, but if anyone has any questions that come to mind now, please do ask them.
I have a question about reapplying from with any schools that did not receive the award in the fall cycle. Mm-hmm. Are there any stipulations or requirements attached to schools that applied in the fall cycle, didn't get the grant, but then want to apply again in the winter cycle?
No, definitely not. I mean, it's really just a second chance to apply, but if they met all the eligibility requirements that would be needed to apply for the fall, there's nothing additional, I would say.
Yeah, so some of the questions that I've been hearing from schools are, some schools do want to reapply, but only if they're able to just resubmit the same grant that we worked on. And I mean, I'm happy to do that and also look and see if there's anything that we can update, but is that feasible to do?
I mean, yeah, I wouldn't say it's like not. I would say that in sending out the original communication, we did leave space for schools to request feedback if they wanted any. So I always think that's a good idea if one is to reapply. And also the fact remains that there are a lot of strong applications that we just can't fund because funds are limited. So it's also entirely possible that they could submit the same thing and get funded. But I would recommend, if possible, to just solicit feedback. I think just to be sure, and or unless there are specific areas where where the school knows, like, okay, these are areas we could beef up. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. And I really appreciate some of the feedback that we've gotten so far. It's been really great to get some insight into some of the thoughts that the reviewers had while reading the application. So should we reach out to you, Olaf, if we want to get
Yeah.
feedback on anything? Okay.
Yes, the CSF at
Yeah.
ingenuity-inc.org is good to reach out to. David, I see you have a hand, but I also see that there are a few questions from Ted as well. I have a partner school with whom I will be applying. Are there schools with whom we are connected that are looking for arts partners? Oh, that's a really great question. I'm sure there are. Maybe I don't know if you could speak more to this, Jess. I'm sure there are. That's certainly something I come across as I talk to schools. I think this is where the Outlook map is a useful tool as far as even just finding schools that might need someone. I think not more often than not, but often it is the arts partners that are making that first outreach step more so than schools. I think just considering capacity, who's able to even have the bandwidth to be actively soliciting partners. So I would totally recommend checking out Outlook and looking for schools that may be lacking in the discipline that you're offering, and maybe doing some outreach and seeing who might be interested or who could be a good partner. And Jess, I don't know if there's anything that you would add to that, but that's what I would suggest.
Yeah, we sort of get the question on the reverse end as much too, whereas I'm looking
Yes.
for a partner that does X. And I will say our department tends to not want to point, and say, oh, well, that school or that arts partner, just to sort of, stay out of that that process, a little bit of an equity issue there. And so, we really do encourage partners as well as schools to keep those Outlook profiles up to date, and really encourage folks to sort of peruse that map and really sort of look and see what those offerings are and look and see what schools are looking for, and keep your profile as partners very up to date and into what you offer. It's really a beneficial tool that I can't stress enough that folks on both sides, the school side and the partner side, should really be utilizing.
Right. I have a quick question, and this is just a clarification. If we work with a school or two to write the application for this winter deadline, and they are assigned a PO, that PO, I just want to clarify that PO will carry over into the next school year, or will we have to, I mean, for example, I would like to get the PO early, even if we don't spend the money in the spring. Is that advisable, just to get the PO as soon as possible and then have the funding sit in a bucket for us for next year?
Oh,
does that make sense?
Sorry, you froze a little bit for me because my internet's a little unstable. You'd think once I left the office, I'd have better internet, but I believe
not great either.
Joanne, I think you're asking the same thing. You popped in the chat, right, about the purchase order carryover. Okay, so I think what we're going to see happen, because this is a little bit new the way we're sort of doing this, but I think what we're going to see happen is that we're going to issue a certain amount of funding in one part of in the spring, and then we're going to you'll have to sort of create a new purchase order with the school for the fall. The funds don't carry over. They sort of come back into our budget, and then we have to push them back out, which is a little bit of a nuisance. But I believe that's sort of our only approach. I know that Julia and I are still working with procurement and accounts payable to see if there's some other angle to that. But I believe the only way we're going to be able to do it is to sort of be like, okay, this is the part that's going to take place from now till June. This is the PO for that work, and this is what's going to take place next year, and this is the PO for that work. And that one just wouldn't get opened until the funds were issued for that piece.
Okay,
does that make sense?
It would, yeah, it does. And I just wanted to reiterate, just to make sure I have it clear when I'm speaking to the schools I'm going to be working with. So we could do some informal planning this spring, not bill for it, and then wait and do the PO for the fall, which is when the work is going to occur. And just, basically like count our chickens from the spring and bill for it then.
You could do that, but you could also sort of build like if you get a grant in March and you build in planning in the spring, you should certainly sort of open a PO for that planning phase and invoice on that amount and then come fall when the new funds get put into schools' budgets, and you're actually like doing the programming, then sort of I would, open a new purchase order, get a new quote ready, open a new purchase order with the school and use those funds for that period.
And can I ask, when would the new school year officially start? I have a high school that wants to do a lot of the work in the fall. So they feel like this is a great opportunity for them to line everything up for next year. Would they be able to open a new PO in August? Uh-oh. Oh, Jess, I'm sorry. My question has blown her off the grid.
Oh man, your question upset her. No, I'm kidding.
Sorry, I went off camera to see if that would help my connection. I don't know if I'm still frozen or not.
No, you're not frozen.
Okay.
I'm coming from my end. I want to be able to advise the school that I'm writing the application with. Would they be able to open the PO in August for September?
I wouldn't encourage that early. It can take a little time for us to sort of get money in our budget and then get it out to a school. So, really think, mid to late September for start dates. That's what I would strongly encourage. And as much as schools say they want to start right at the beginning, I always think that sounds a little bit risky. So with the beginning of school year being so hectic for everybody involved. So it's a little challenging for us to sort of, sometimes we have to wait for money to get to us and before we can get it to other folks. So that's sort of something I'd encourage.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you.
And I know, David, you had a hand up. Was that the same question that you typed in the chat as well?
Yeah, just because because a department chair would not qualify for instructional leadership. It wouldn't qualify for school governance, right?
Jess, I think this is a question you can answer, as I am unsure.
Well, and just to basically we have always had an electives department chair, somebody who oversaw the electives department, but then they technically aren't on the instructional leadership team that we have right above that. And I think it might just be a difference in vocabulary. So I just wanted to be sure, because definitely not school governance, but there is curriculum development and stuff like that happening at the department level.
So I would have to look up the specific wording of the the question on the survey, because it's very specific as to sort of what those leadership pieces are. And I don't have it right at my fingertips, but it would, if it's included in that, then yes, but if it's not, then I don't think that it would sort of qualify as that.
Let me pull it up real quick. Sorry, because it's just very confusing to me. Because it said school governance, but then also gave instructional leadership as an example, but it's not technically. Yeah, okay. So here it is. It's arts instructor on school governance team at the top, arts instructor on curriculum or instruction team, arts included in school-wide strategic plan, and then none in order.
And so your question is whether an electives department chair counts as school governance.
Yeah, or on arts instructor on curriculum or instruction team, stuff like that.
But there, you're saying there's an instructional leadership team that sort of is outside of your
Yes, that's
your
love it. Yeah.
yeah. So I'm not 100% sure, and it might be a question, Ola, that we check in with Steve and Angela on, because it's definitely sort of on the line on that piece. And I'm trying to look it up myself on the scoring rubric.
If we can't find an answer right now, if you could just follow up over email, and we can.
I don't want to take more time, sorry.
No, certainly follow up on email, so we
Yeah.
can get you a clear answer, because I think it's a little, it's pretty, I think your question's a little nuanced and specific to your specific situations, but we'd love to get an answer for you.
And I saw that there was also a question about can arts groups work with multiple schools? Yes. Yes, and several do.
Yeah, that was my question. You answered that after I answered it. So it was.
Oh, okay.
So you already answered that question, which I appreciate that. I will ask you though an additional question instead. So I have been a vendor for CPS for a number of years, and I've done a lot of programs with different schools, but I've not worked with you guys at all. And so I'm really excited to work with you because I think it makes some of my partnerships with the schools a little easier on the schools, right? So it's a little, we can kind of do more things. But I would be very interested in, and I know maybe this is something I need to go look at the website or something. I'd love to kind of get a feel for some of the programs that have been successful with you all and what they've accomplished and what they've done. And, obviously I can go dig in that, but if there's anything that you can just highlight in a short, brief way, I'd love to just sort of hear. It helps me to even kind of wrap my mind around kind of how this can look in a very successful way.
That is a great question. Yes, you're totally right, and that our website certainly has additional information. But I would say, as a whole, we fund a really wide variety of programs that span disciplines. I would say, at least in past years, what's been more common or something we've seen a lot of is schools partnering with dance organizations or just organizations that offer programming that isn't readily available at schools. So I believe that visual arts and also music are like more common. If a school has an arts program, it's usually one or both of those things. So I'd say a lot of organizations that fall outside of that tend to be successful, but also a lot of music and visual arts organizations are successful too. I think what's made the most impactful collaborations, and there are people on this call who are grantees or who've worked with schools that were grantees and had successful programming. I'd say what's most important is just collaboration and real intentionality behind creating lessons and curriculum that responds to student interest. But that's a hard question to answer because the fund really does support a really wide variety of programs. So
I would be, and I'll shut up after this, but I would be very interested once again as someone who's new to this space with you all, in having, I don't know if there's any opportunities to talk to sort of other grantees and kind of, share notes and war stories and that sort of thing. I don't know if that exists, but I'd be very open or interested in something like that.
Yeah, there's some right on this call that you can totally connect with. Yeah.
I mean, I'd be happy to talk to you, Theodore, about what you're doing. I think the most important thing that anyone who's on the call who's an organization is this is not an application for you to do like your boilerplate that you would do to a funder. Like this has to be an authentic conversation that you've had with the school. And I think it really shows in the applications and I haven't read them, but I have watched some of my applications be handled by else, and I was not happy with the results. And I think it's just something to be very aware of. It's an authentic conversation with you and the school about what does the school really need and why are you the person to bring it. And I think if that comes through in the application, I think that is 90% of the battle. Because I think oftentimes the people do kind of their grant speak applications, it doesn't really tell the reader anything that seems authentic. So that's my words of wisdom on writing Creative Schools Fund.
Thank you so much.
And I can just add on one other thing too, I think is important is building the relationships with the teachers that the program is going to take place with. Since we can't push into arts time, oftentimes these have to be integrated residencies that take place during normal instructional time. So the more buy-in and relationship building we can do with like the 3rd grade teachers or the 6th or 8th grade teachers to get everybody on board with what's going to happen and how we're going to blend in what their unit subjects or themes are during the time that we're there, I think the more success we tend to see in the programming.
That's a great point. Yes, all great points. All great. Yes.
If he wants to know which of the partners that the schools go with, he could probably look at the past grantees, and they have a list of the different partnerships. And also what Green does, we realize this is a children's education. So we don't go forward unless we have surveyed the children to find out what it is they need to know, want to learn. Because we found in the past that when you involve the students, then they'll make it work.
That's great.
So this is how we do it.
Thank you.
All great points.
Yeah, thank you all very much.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. Okay, I'm looking through the chat. It doesn't look like there are any other questions. Okay, last call. We do have a few extra minutes here. So if any questions have come up since then, otherwise, you're always welcome to email myself and or Jess at, I'll just type the email addresses in the chat for reference.
I guess I'll take the final couple minutes if I can, since I have the most questions, if that's all right. I'll just ask another quick question. So because the programs are not funded for after school, nor can they impede on the current arts staff instructional time, are most of the programs kind of doing arts integrated kind of things? And I just be very interested in navigating. I've done after school programs, but obviously this is a little bit different niche. And I just was interested in sort of, maybe one person can answer kind of how they've navigated that in terms of, working with the school in that, I think, a very unique space. And I wonder if it's very heavily arts integrated with sort of the curriculum that already exists. And I think maybe someone's touched on that already, but I'd be interested in hearing any more about that.
I don't think it's one or the other. Do you, Ola? I think
no, it's a variety.
I think it really depends on what the school's looking for. And oftentimes, as Ola said, the dance and theater applications are really going to schools that don't have dance and theater. The visual arts grants sometimes are working with a larger concept with a classroom teacher. And or I've had arts teachers say, like, I have no idea how to do sculpture. Library a sculptor in to do this work. So I think it can be either arts to build density, like arts learning density for the students, as well as it can be arts integration, or it can be just looking at that idea, we have a deficit, deficit in our school of being able to do the right amount of minutes with kids. And so we need more experiences for our students. I mean,
Got it,
I think
thanks.
all of the above.
Yes, precisely. That was a comprehensive answer, and I would not add anything to that.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you all. This was perfect timing since we're right at 6. So if you need to hop off, definitely. I will be sticking around for a couple minutes in case anyone has any one-to-one questions for anything more extensive. Again, I've put in our email addresses if you would like to talk through anything or have any additional questions beyond this call. But for those of you who are hopping off, thank you for joining us during this very busy month. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your months if I don't see you, and hopefully enjoy a restful break and or holiday season.
Thank you, Ola. I had one just final question, just because I had a school who really wanted me to ask this. So the schools that are given the invitation only to access those like arts essentials funds, things like that, is there a particular like set of requirements that you guys are applying? Are you like handpicking schools that you're offering that to, or how does that process look on the back end?
Yeah, so that process is entirely informed by our creative school certification data that we have for these schools. So that will indicate areas where they may need more support in certain spaces, and that dictates the schools we reach out to. So it's very much informed by the data that these schools submit. So it's handpicking in a sense, but like informed in the sense that we're really trying to connect the dots between areas where there may be deficits in their certification and in their arts access, and ways we can support that through the fund.
Is it public on the Outlook map? I know you can see the certification, but can we also see the breakdown, like between access, instructional minutes, all that stuff?
Yeah.
So the survey results for this year are not going to be released publicly. We're trying to be really mindful of the fact that the past couple of years have been rather unique for schools, and that we didn't feel that it was okay to sort of share them publicly. While schools actually just received their scores today, they are welcome to share them with whoever they like, and we hope that they do, but we are not as a district going to push them out publicly in the way that we have done in the past. Hopefully next year that, for this year, we'll sort of, I think, speak with our leadership and make a decision whether those would be public again or not, but normally that they are, and you can sort of see that scoring. But again, we've decided due to the nature of the last couple of years to not do that.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll just direct them to go look at their own scores, and they can probably take a peek and make some assessments from that. Thank you all. Appreciate your time. Morgan, good to see you. Bye.
Take care, Sam.
Hi, Sam. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye. Take care. Okay, hanging on for any questions? Yes.
No more. Well, no, you're going to be here all night.
Oh, I would definitely set a cutoff. Once it's 6:10, I'm definitely signing off.
Because this is my first time, I would need more of a one-on-one kind of talk, because I don't know.
Yeah.
What's going on? Only because the person who set this up is now gone.
Okay.
Information wasn't necessarily relayed to me, so it's just like playing catch up while learning in the moment. So
Got it. Okay.
One time, and I'll email both of those emails just to set up some one-on-one time.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. You all have a good night.
You too, Destiny. Take care. Okay, so I'm not sure. I don't know if Bernita or Latricia or Anne have questions, or if you're just still on the call.
We're still here, but I was just staying on just in case somebody asked something that I needed to know about.
Yeah, of course.
Of course. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. It seems like I'm just gonna say there are no other questions, so I think we can hang up. Of course, feel free to email if anything does come to mind, and we're happy to chat and answer any questions.
Okay, now wait a minute, but one thing, you said you would be available on the 1st, the 3rd, and the 4th of February, but like you said, we can email and ask other questions prior
Yes.
to.
So
Okay,
so those specific office hours, like those are specifically scheduled towards the end of the application period,
yes,
knowing
yes.
that's the time when schools are going to be like down to the wire and they'll have questions. So you're welcome to email me ahead of time as well, but we will be posting those office hours publicly. So you can also make an appointment if you have a more application specific question.
Okay, and thank you very much.
Thank
No
you.
problem. Thank you for attending. Take care.
You as
All right, have
well.
a good evening.
You too. Bye.
Bye.